Destiny could shove it. That was the single thought John had slowly come to in the past 5 hours, as the exhausted Guardian finally managed to grasp the ledge above him. Gingerly testing his footing, he placed a little more pressure on his right leg, wincing as the stone beneath it shifted ominously. Gritting his teeth, he reached up with his other hand and prayed. A minute ticked by. The whisper of the wind below him caused his fists to tighten on their precarious hold. With an excessive amount of care, John slowly drew himself up. Inch by inch, the young warlock hoisted himself higher. His ears strained for any sounds of falling rocks, and his feet steady as he climbed the last foot or so, his chest breaking over the edge of the cliff. As soon as his upper body was on firm ground, John exploded into motion, hands flailing and legs thrashing, as he did his utmost to put as much distance between himself and the hole he just climbed out of. A chasm or bottomless pit would probably be a better descriptor than hole, though, at least in John's mind. Taking a ragged, well-deserved gulp of air, John rolled over onto his back and stared at the bright blue sky. Wincing as he felt strained and tired muscles finally being able to relax, he deemed it nap time. "Well, Guardian, I'm glad you made it out," Cressea said, gleaming into existence near his shoulder. John swatted a hand towards the small thing, though the appendage was slow and swung wide by almost a foot. "Yeah, no thanks to you." "I'd say quite to the contrary," the ghost said, and John could just feel the smugness in her voice. "I believe this was a rather unique learning experience for you. You would probably qualify as a mountain ranger quite easily after this." "I would rather die," John stated. Pausing for a moment to think that phrase over. "I take that back. I'm over dying." "Even still, your determination is to be commended," Cressea continued. "I am certain any other Guardian would have given up the climb hours ago in favor of transmitting to their ship." "We do not have a ship," John ground out, his ire colouring his words. "True, but that does not diminish the feat of accomplishment." The ghost seemed to blink as John linked his helmet away and glared at her. "I'm being serious here. You just climbed nearly 800 feet of sheer rock," she said defensively. John just snorted and rolled over, pushing his tired body up to a kneeling position as he shot the chasm a hateful look. A few yards before him, the ground simply seemed to vanish. A swath cut through the earth, directly across the road he'd been travelling on throughout the night. He shivered at the thought of trying to crawl out of that pit in the dark. Darker than it already was down there anyways. Shaking his head, he stood up and relinked his helmet. "So, how much further?" he asked, turning his thoughts back to the path before him and away from his pike, which was currently a smouldering ruin at the bottom of the pit. Cressea floated up next to his shoulder, her pieces rotating as she thought, "About another week if we keep up a steady pace, though there is a chance we'll hit a human settlement since we are getting closer to the city." "There's people living this far out?" Jean asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. "Some," Cressea answered. "It isn't uncommon for some to grow tired of living inside the walls. There are many villages and small towns in the frontier. They do tend to be a little rough, though." "What do you mean, rough?" Cressea rolled her eye. "Well, while Guardians aren't uncommon, most of the towns consist of regular people. Those strong enough to survive outside the walls are often quite self-sufficient, to put it lightly. They must be able to fight off roving fallen and provide largely for themselves." John nodded, thinking back to how he struggled to deal with his enemies at the start. To face them without unlimited lives made him shudder. The people had to be strong to last long out here. "Well, not much point in hanging around here," John said, with one last glance towards the pit behind him. Right, Cressea agreed. "We're burning daylight." It was 3 days after losing his pike before John saw any signs of life aside from roving patrols of fallen. No pikes, however. Standing on what once was the balcony of an apartment complex, though the upper floors were long gone, he stared out at a distant flicker of smoke. "Do you think it's fallen?" he asked. His ghost gave what he assumed was a shrug, two of her pieces shifting up and down once. More than likely, but we are close enough to the walls that it might be people. Either way, it's supplies and possibly a ride to the walls. John shrugged, linking and retrieving his rifle. Well, what do you say to taking it slow and easy? Sounds like a warlock plan if I've ever heard one, she said, dissolving into a sparkle of motes. John nodded and leapt off the balcony, flexing his legs as he landed before making his way towards the lazy wisp in the distance. An hour later, John slowed his pace even further. The thin trail of smoke grew thicker as he drew closer, and he could faintly hear various sounds that differed from the usual hum of forest life. Crouching low, he began to belly crawl through the brush, coming to a stop halfway in a bush. The ground was covered in a thick moss-like growth that was surprisingly soft. He gently pushed a stiff branch out of his way. On the other side of the bush, a shallow valley opened up before him. Nestled among the trees stood a village, a human village. John's eyes widened behind his visor as he watched a group of children kicking a ball back and forth while several adults tended to various chores. One man, a rifle slung over his shoulder, was helping a woman hang up a large blanket on a piece of wire. He noted the woman was carrying a pistol on her hip. On the other side of the little camp, 3 more people were carrying a large log between themselves. John could barely tear his eyes away. People. Actual people were here. A last smile blossomed across his face as he watched from his cover. Idly, he felt the branch he'd pushed away rub against the back of his helmet. He waved a hand over his head to brush it away. Wow, he said under his breath. It looks like they've got quite the setup here. Several large buildings stood around a large clearing, though somewhat ramshackle. They looked sturdy enough. Large pieces of metal and tarps were used as patches for the more warm buildings, though several were clearly newer. Large logs had been carefully cut and carved to fit together snugly, and clearly made to last for a long time. The branch came back to click against his helmet again. Looks like everyone is carrying some form of weapon, he idly noted to himself. But I would have thought they'd have some kind of guard set up, you know. Oh, I'd bet my shot that they do, Grosea said, having rematerialized next to him. You probably just haven't noticed them yet. For some reason, she wasn't looking at him or the camp. I think I would have noticed them if I walked by one, John said, as he glanced over at her. I haven't seen or heard anything besides birds for a while now. Nearby, a bird whistled. See? Like that, he said, turning his attention back towards the small village. Grosea turned to stare at him. Maybe that wasn't a bird, she said. Maybe it was a signal. John huffed. I doubt it. The bird gave another whistle. It sounded like it was right beside him. He kind of wanted to see what kind it was, but at the same time he didn't want to scare it away. Instead, he gently brushed the branch away from his head again. See? He said, glancing at the ghost. That sounds exactly like a real bird. Why, thank you, a low voice said, sounding amused to the point of giggling. Anyways, John said, watching the kids playing at the edge. I wonder how I should introduce myself. Should I just walk up and say hi? That'd probably be better than watching from the bush like some kind of creep. John blinked and looked at Grosea. You can change your voice, he asked, realizing she sounded a bit different. Grosea didn't say anything for several moments. Her shutter twitching slightly, she seemed to glance between him and the bush he was hiding in. No, John, no I cannot, she finally said, her voice the same somewhat tinny sound he was familiar with. Huh? John asked, focusing on the ghost. But if that wasn't you, then... The branch tinked against his helmet in a slow, rhythmic pattern, with more force than he would expect from a piece of wood, swaying in the breeze. It also sounded mildly metallic. Something filtered into the forefront of the Guardian's thoughts. Not that I'm not flattered, the bush itself said, but you're kind of heavy. You mind getting off my lap? John froze still as a board before slowly turning his head towards the sound of the voice. Blinking, he could almost see what looked like a face behind the leaves and branches. The face smiled. Looking further to the side, John noticed the branch that had been tapping at the back of his helmet. The muzzle brake on the end made his eyes cross. Very slowly, John crawled back the way he came, acutely aware that what he'd thought was soft moss was actually clothing. Clothing that someone was wearing. "Oh, thank the traveller, I can feel my legs," the bush said as it shifted to the side. The part he'd been laying on breaking away from the rest of it as the person stood up. "You can drop the helmet if you don't mind," the figure said, as the branch-looking rifle levelled itself at his chest. Cressea floated up next to his shoulder as his helmet was stored back in the link. She did not look very impressed with him. To be fair, John wasn't very impressed with himself either at the moment, something more than likely obvious since it felt like his face was bright red. "Huh, you ain't half bad looking," the bush person said, one leaf-covered arm coming up to pull off the headgarb. "What's your name, Guardian?" John," he said, scratching the back of his head. A smirk touched the other person's face. Her darker tone of skin was covered in what he assumed was paint. Streaks of black, brown, and various shades of green surrounded dark brown eyes. "Guessing you're new, if you ain't got a last name yet," she said, resting the rifle on her shoulder. John nodded as Cressea floated forwards a little. "Less than a week old," she said. "He's still learning about things." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's a little slow, but he's got spirit." The woman laughed as John's cheeks heated up more, rubbing his arm with one hand. Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't even see you there." "Well, thank you for the compliment," she said, giving a small bow. "You can call me Soraya. Pleasure to meet you, John, and..." She trailed off, glancing at the ghost. "Oh, right, this is Cressea Moores," John said, gesturing towards the machine before turning back. "It's nice to meet you, Soraya. You're the first person I've met since Cressea resurrected me." "Well then, let me introduce you to some more," Soraya said, before letting out a bird call. A moment later, another call answered from somewhere to their left. "It's about time for my break anyways," she said, tossing her head in the direction of the village before turning and walking down the hill. John waited for her to get a few feet in front of him before he turned to Cressea. "Why didn't you warn me?" he whisper-yelled, subtly glancing between the bush lady and the smug-looking ghost. "I gave you plenty of hints, John," she answered back, at normal speaking volume. "Besides, I didn't even notice her there until it was too late anyways." "When was too late?" he asked. "When I was laying in her lap?" "Yes, about then. Right about the time you pushed her rifle out of the way." John gestured wildly for a moment, trying to express his annoyance with the little floating ball. Finally, he gave up in favour of crossing his arms and sullenly following Soraya the last 200 or so yards to the settlement. "Hey, George!" Soraya shouted as they drew closer. "Tell Ma we got a visitor." One of the men who had been carrying logs from the forest looked up, his gaze shifting to the guardian behind her before nodding and turning towards one of the larger buildings. Soraya glanced over her shoulder to John. "Come on, take a seat by the fire. I'm going to go ungilly myself." John gave a word of thanks as he moved towards the large fire pit in front of what he assumed was a lodge. Several spits of meat were turning over the fire. The smell of spices and herbs wafted over him. His stomach growled loudly. "Why, hello there, Guardian!" A new voice called from behind him. Turning, John saw a woman with grey and green robes coming out of the lodge. Her hair was sandy-coloured with shocks of grey running through the neatly tied braid, falling over her shoulder down to her waist. Lightly tanned skin, weather-worn with deep lines, and a warm smile that seemed to make her glow. John leapt to his feet and gave a small bow. "Hello, ma'am. Sorry to intrude. I was just passing through on my way to the city." "Oh, do away with the posh," she said, smiling brightly at him. "You make me feel old calling me that. Sit. I'm sure you've been travelling a while." She waved at the collection of benches and chairs that surrounded the fire pit and the long table that stood to the side. "And call me Ma or Juniper, please. I'm not that old." John smiled at her as he drew out a chair and sat down. It felt nice to actually have a proper chair for once, and he leaned back with a sigh. "So," Ma said, drawing up a chair opposite him and uncorking a bottle that had been sitting to the side. "Tell me a little about yourself. I can guess at a few details, but it's much more fun to hear them." John took the glass she offered, bringing it to his lips and sniffing at the amber liquid before taking a sip. A fruity apple flavour exploded in his mouth, his eyes widening as he downed the drink. My, thirsty are we?" The woman laughed, as John took a deep breath. "Is the cider that good?" John wiped his mouth with the back of his gloves. "That's delicious. I've never tasted anything like that before," he said, savouring the lingering flavour. "Well, not that I've really tasted much." "A newly risen guardian," Juniper nodded. "I suppose you're in quite the hurry to make it to the city, then?" Cressea floated up next to his shoulder. "Well, yes and no. More make it to civilization." "Why, hello, little ghost," the woman said, turning her smile to her. "I suppose you must be quite happy to have found your guardian." "Yes, very much so, even if he's a little prone to falling." "Hey," John huffed. "I take offence to that. I've accomplished more than just falling to my death." "Quite," John hunched, as Soraya's voice spoke up behind him. "Like crawling into my lap without seeing me." Juniper let out a trilling laugh as the younger woman sat down at the corner of the table, a smug grin on her face. John's face buried itself into the table. "Like I said," Cressea chirped, "he is still learning about the world." After a few moments of laughter, Juniper finally took pity on him with a soft pat on the head. "Well, we can hardly send you back off into the wilds like you are," she said, a motherly smile flashing across her face. "Tell me a little about yourself." John sat back up and accepted another glass of apple juice, sipping it slowly this time. "Well, like Cressea told Soraya, I've only been raised for about a week. Cressea has got me fairly caught up on the whole Guardian thing, along with some equipment." Juniper nodded. "So I see. I take it you've already encountered some Fallen, then?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." A raised eyebrow cut him off. Juniper," he corrected himself. "Cressea was able to make me armour and a weapon already." "Mind if I see it?" Soraya piped up. John shrugged and retrieved his auto-rifle from the link, handing it over to her. "Oh, and I've already unlocked my first ability." Soraya was turning the pariah over in her hands. "Oh? What do you get?" "Malaya, art class," he answered, sipping more of his juice. A wider smile stretched across the old woman's face. "My, what a coincidence." John blinked at the woman before glancing over at Cressea, who shrugged her shell. He looked back at Juniper with a puzzled expression. "Oh, I forgot to mention it," she said. "Our little clan here and my last name." With a small flourish, she swept one hand out and around to the buildings and people working and playing. "Welcome to the Art Clan family. No relation to the class, but an amusing occurrence nonetheless." John felt a small grin crawl across his face. "Huh, that is funny." "Well, you are more than welcome to join us for supper," she said. "Though we may not have a lot, we are more than willing to share what we can." "Oh, thank you, but like I said, I wouldn't want to impose," John said, waving a hand in front of him. "I don't really have anything to pay you back with anyways." "You can fight, can't you?" Soraya asked, handing his rifle back. "Or is this just a fancy paperweight?" John let the rifle disappear into thin air. "I can, but I'm not very good at it." "I'll make you a deal, John," Juniper said, filling his glass up once more. "We have a shipment of produce heading to the city here in 2 weeks. We usually put out a patrol beacon a week beforehand and wait for a guardian willing to escort it to the city. If you are willing to wait, I'm certain we can keep you fed until then." "Maybe we can get some training into you as well," Soraya asked, shooting him a smirk. "Wouldn't do for you to shout to the Vanguard without some experience." John mulled it over for a total of 3 seconds. The meat cooking over the fire next to him did smell amazing, and with a nod from Cressea, reached out and shook hands. "Sounds good to me." "Not bad, Guardian," Soraya said with a slow clap as she walked up behind him. "Not bad at all." John grunted and rolled his shoulder, feeling the now familiar relief of light that washed over his body. At his feet lay a dozen or so dregs, a scouting party that had ventured into the valley he and Soraya had been camping. The ambush had gone off cleanly, with her hiding up in the cliffside with her rifle, a DMR he'd learned, and him hiding among the rocks. He'd waited until the last one had passed his position before opening up with his auto-rifle. All in all, the fight had taken less than 20 seconds, and according to Soraya, fast enough that a call for backup was almost impossible. He hadn't even died. He grinned at the darker-toned woman, who he'd learned had just turned 19, before settling about scavenging weapon parts and other valuables from their remains. 10 pieces of spin metal and 400 glimmer later, he helped drag the remains towards a boulder resting to the side of the ravine. With a heave, he dropped the body he was carrying down the hole behind the rock. Soraya had explained that the fallen patrols disappearing out in the wilds was common. Less common were large numbers of bodies riddled with bullets being found. The Ark clan had taken to striking in seemingly random areas, often far from their farm, and hiding the bodies either underground or buried. Soraya dumped the last dread carcass in the hole and tossed a glass bottle down after it, quickly followed by a match. "You know," she said, readjusting her rifle, "this would be a lot easier if you were a soul warlock. I hear they can disintegrate their enemies completely." John shrugged. "I don't think I'll be able to do that for a long time. Crusade said that Guardians have to study for years to master their abilities." Sounds boring," she said, turning and slinging one of their packs over her shoulder. "I'd rather just live my life out here. Way more peaceful than being cooped up in the city." "Is that where you're from?" "Yeah, pretty much everyone is from the city," she said, giving him a look as he gathered the remaining 4 bags of loot like they were nothing. "That's just unfair." "Want me to carry yours too? It looks a little heavy," John teased, resting the bags under one arm, his gun held in the other. "Shove off," she grumbled half-heartedly, turning and backtracking her way towards the farm, agreeing John following behind. Starlight twinkled above as John sat overlooking the farm. He idly traced various constellations the others had told him about, and watching the occasional flare of her ship's engine as they streaked across the sky. He wondered what the world looked like from up there, what the other places Crusade had told him about looked like. It was a sobering thought. "That's an awfully long look you're wearing, John." A voice shook him from his thoughts. Turning slightly, John noticed Nikolous Ark, Juniper's husband, climb up the last ledge to the roof he'd been sitting on. "Oh, sorry, Nikolous, I hope I wasn't disturbing you," he said, wondering if he'd started humming again. It had been an odd tic he found himself struggling with after the first couple of days of being around other people. The older man gave a soft chuckle. "Not at all, son." A gentle smile on his face. "Just wanted to thank you for the help around the place." John blinked. "I don't feel like I've done all that much." "Nonsense." Nikolous tapped his shoulder as he settled down next to him. "From what Soraya tells me, the farm is safer because of you." John blushed. While compliments were common since he'd arrived at the farm, he still felt awkward about them. Maybe it was another quirk from his past life. Still, he murmured out his acceptance before turning back to the sky. "You know, I've often wondered what lies out there," Nikolous spoke up, letting the statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Then I realized how much I would miss out on down here. Guess I kind of realized that what is most important isn't what is out of our reach, but what we can hold on to." John let the words linger before shifting his gaze from the sky back to the farm. They were sitting on the barn storage shed overlooking the lodge and cooking pits. "What if what you want is out of your reach?" he asked. "Want is always out of reach," the other man replied. "It's an ever-changing thing. There are only 3 things anyone ever truly desires, at least those of us who aren't insane." "3 things?" John's brows furrowed. While he might be young, he could think of more than 3 things he wanted. Nikolous nodded softly. "Yup, only 3 things." John narrowed his eyes at the man. This was another of his word games, something the older man seemed fond of. John still hadn't forgiven him for the 11 fingers word game thing. "What's the 3 things?" Plain ignorant had been an early lesson he learned in the last week and a half with the Ark clan. Let's see. Nikolous made a show of stroking his dusty blonde beard. A warm place to sleep would be the first, and second would be someone to love and grow old with. Third is always the tricky one. John didn't miss the twinkle in his eye. Third, for me at least, is the knowledge that I did the absolute best I could for the second. A light shove and a loud laugh as John nudged the man. "You're whipped. You know that, right?" he declared, unwilling to fight the smile that covered his face, like completely whipped. A pearly smile and bright blue eyes met his own. "Boy, someday you'll know what I'm talking about. Also, you don't get to talk shit to you can beat me at arm wrestling." You think Mom would like to know you're teaching me swear words? John shot back. I'll just blame Soraya. Yeah, she'd probably believe that. John laughed, before trailing off and staring back at the stars. You know, Nikolous said softly, won't be too long before you're up there, racing across the sky to fight the darkness. John gave a glance at the star-filled void, before he looked back to the slumbering farm before him. Yeah, I know. But I'll have something to fight for, people to protect. That you will, son. Nikolous clapped him on the shoulder. We'll be waiting for you when you get back.